Hello and welcome to another episode of Relationship Calls. My name is Sam Tabete, and as always, thank you for tuning in. I'm very excited about this episode. We are at episode 10. It is quite a milestone for me, and I have so much appreciation for the support that you guys have shown over the last 9 episodes. I'm very grateful for the feedback and everything that I've heard, good or bad, from people listening in. I'm also quite proud of what I've done here, and it is very humbling to see that people all across the world have continued to listen to this podcast. So thank you very much for tuning in. I really mean it when I say thank you. In today's episode, we'll be dealing with discontentment. Now, before we go on with the content of the episode, I would just like to give you a sneak preview of what we'll be covering in the next couple of weeks. And the next, give it 3 or 4 episodes, we'll be dealing with issues that are intrapersonal. Now, in the last 9 episodes, we've dealt with marriage, we've dealt with work relationships, we've dealt with friendships, and only one of the episodes really dealt with intrapersonal relationships. So interpersonal relationships only, but it is also about intrapersonal relationships. So the internal state of affairs is also as important as how our external relationships are going. Now, this one is particularly important because the feeling of discontentment is usually what leads to something we spoke about with my friend Wafid in episode 8 and 9, where we spoke about depression. And a lot of people struggle with depression. A lot of people struggle with reconciling where they are in life and where they'd hope to be at that particular point of their lives. And today's episode is really all about that. And I'll be giving you a couple of tips on how to overcome that or how to deal with that. So let us get into it. Disappointment and discontentment are like conjoined twins. There's really one without the other, because the reason for this is how both of these feelings are caused by the same issue, so to speak. So we get disappointed in life when the outcome of anything that we had hoped for does not necessarily match the expectations that we had. Getting back to that comment I made about reconciling where you are and where you'd hope you be. And in the same way, we're not willing to accept our current situation because we expect that it should be something other than what it is. So for our purposes, we'll use discontentment and disappointment interchangeably. In the recent weeks, I've really been struck by the amount of discontentment among my peers. And this is really sort of like a plague, because what haunts us is the desire to be anywhere else but where we are. And we wish we'd earned more. We wish we had better lovers. We wish we lived in bigger homes. And we've got so many wishes. We even wish that we weighed less, or some of us, we wish that we weighed more. And the point is that we're really content with who and where we are. Now, social media and influencers who always seem to have life figured out are really no help in this area, because even moments of celebration have become sour because of our unmet expectations. We've kind of subjected ourselves to the weight of expectations, and this really dampens how we feel about ourselves and about where our life is at that point. For instance, getting to the age of 30 is now less of a moment for appreciation because, in the case of some ladies, you are single and unmarried. And for others, it's a case of, oh, I haven't landed on the point where I'd like to be on the corporate ladder by now. And I feel a lot less joyous about my life. And sometimes it's even worse because our friendships are made sour because one friend doesn't feel. So, the timing of this recording of this episode is not ironic because, or not a coincidence, because I've just been looking at the fact that we are midway through July and we've just passed the midway point of the year 2022. And mid-year is quite a frustrating time because we've all started the year with resolutions and hopes for our lives. And some people were like, oh, this is a new year, an opportunity to change my life, new year, new me. And mid-year is a reminder of how badly we've done in achieving the goals that we set out to achieve at the beginning of the year. Some people ask, how's your New Year's resolutions doing? Um, I think 2 or 3 weeks I saw something like that. And it's really telling how the problem is not a lack of motivation or an intention, but the problem is thinking in terms of milestones. And I'd like to call this milestone thinking. And this is the issue because milestone thinking is what keeps us from appreciating our progress. Usually, we like to say, I'll be very happy when I make X thousand more than I do now. And that is kind of short-sighted because if I'm planning or if I'm saying I would be happier if I made $10,000 more, I really appreciate a progression of $1,000 or $2,000 more rather than seeing it as I'm making more than I did before. I'm seeing it as I'm $8,000 away from my target. So you earn more than what you once earned, and you are closer to what you're desiring, and you're failing to appreciate that. And this is an issue with thinking in terms of milestones because you don't celebrate the wins during the process, but you're so fixated on where you want to be. And in other instances where, say, maybe you want to lose 10 kilograms, every kilogram lost is usually met with words like, I got another 9 kgs to go. But you just weighed less than you did a week ago. So that's something worth celebrating. So the issue with milestone thinking is that we develop a habit of deferring our happiness for so long that being discontent or being dissatisfied with where we are becomes a habit. You hear people say, one down, nine more to go. And if that's how you think, then you're never satisfied because you're always shifting the goalpost. You're always deferring your happiness, and it always depends on the occurrence of something or the non-occurrence of something. And that is not a way to live because between 9 kgs lost and 1 kg lost, there's a journey there. And the journey is filled with a progression from 1 kilogram, 2 kilograms, 3 kilograms, and so forth. And all of that is worth celebrating. You'll never savor the progression or savor the change that you're going through physically if you're going to be fixed on a particular number on the scale. Now, this leads me to the idea of goal thinking versus system thinking. In his book Atomic Habits, James Clear argues against goal thinking because goals have a tendency of deferring our sense of satisfaction with our efforts. What is also true about goals is that they tend to be what everyone else desires. So think of this from a perspective of a competition in sports. Every team that enters a sports competition is in it to win it. So they all have the same goal, yet there'll only be one winner. And if all the teams that are competing in that competition measure how successful they were by whether or not they won that competition, then they will never appreciate the steps they make toward progress. that is something worth celebrating because they are moving uh, more and more in their progression toward becoming a better team. And that's what it communicates. And a system kind of thinking can be more telling on their improvements because that change from being, say, fourth place to third place is an improvement, and it highlights the areas in which they have improved and the areas that there's still room for improvement for the next competition. And this would be true in the case of not throwing out the baby with the bath water. You always hear that saying because a lot of us, when we think in terms of goals, the idea of achieving the goal in and of itself is mutually exclusive. It's all or nothing. I achieve the goal or I don't. And not necessarily hitting that target is sour because that's all we're fixated on. And this is another shortfall of goal thinking. It imputes failure on every aspect of the systematic changes that we've gone through to achieve that goal. So think of me losing 9 kilograms instead of 10 if I set out to lose 10 kilograms. I may have changed the way that I eat. I may have changed the way that I sleep. I may also have changed my activity levels. I might be more active. And not many people would feel a sense of pride with a progress of 9 kilograms, having set out to lose 10. And the thinking would be that, I'm so close yet so far. I'm 1 kilogram away from my target, and not the fact that I'm 9 kilograms lighter than I was. And this is a typical example of how goal thinking clouds your perspective. So, goal thinking is typically mutually exclusive, as I mentioned earlier on. Either I hit the target or I'm sour. And this disables you from appreciating the other great things in your life or the other great things that have happened en route to getting to where you are. And I hear many people complain that they are not where they should be in life, yet they have so many great things going for them in other areas of their lives. And they're usually fixated on stuff they won't consider to be important on their deathbeds. And yes, I did go that far because I think death really shifts things to perspective for us. And when you start thinking about whether or not I'll consider what I'm so fixated on or so worried about as important on my deathbed is very telling. I am reminded of um, a concept that I learned not so long ago about the Gravestone Experiment, where you sit back and you think to yourself, what is it that I'd like to be inscribed or written on my gravestone? And I personally want to have the words, though I won't have a grave because I want to be cremated, but I want to have the words a father, a husband, and a great friend. The reason why I want to have those is because that's what I believe to be important in my life. I also want to have a man of faith on my tombstone because those are the four things that really matter to me: my faith, my relationship with my wife, because how I treat my wife is very influential on the perspective that our children will have on marriage, and how I raise my children is very influential on how they see the world and how they approach the relationship of fatherhood. And my friendships are very important because the acquaintances and the relationships I build with people around me are important in terms of the reputation that I have and in terms of what I pass on to my children. And lastly, the fact that the friendships I have is usually the basis or the foreground in which I'm going to raise my children. So if I have great friendships, guess what? That will affect how I raise my children because that will be what they are seeing. I usually have frequent interactions with my friends, and that really is a demonstration of my true character to my children. So it is all interlinked or intertwined, and these are the things that are most important to me. Everything else should feed into that. And if it doesn't fit the bill in terms of these 4 criteria, then it more or less isn't as important as it usually feels like in the moment. So we attach meaning to things that don't really matter. And this is really an issue for us in terms of goal thinking. After all is said and done, how many people will remember you by how rich you were and how well you dressed? Because if those people remember you that way, then they're very shallow and you should really check your relationships. Now, having laid the foundation of the issue of discontentment and feeling less than about where we are in our lives, let's get into the tips for overcoming that feeling. Now, I'll be laying out 5 tips for you. This is not an exhaustive list, and you could have other tips that you'd find helpful in this area. But I believe that these are key and would more or less agree on these 5 tips. Now, tip number 1 is celebrate the wins. And celebrating wins along the route or along the way to your ultimate goal is important. Mind you, the goal here is not the milestone. So my goal shouldn't necessarily be to lose 10 kilograms. My goal should be to become a person who would be at that milestone. So I currently weigh 85 kilograms and say I wanted to be 75 kilograms. The goal shouldn't be to be at 75. The goal should be becoming a person who would be 75 kilograms. And a person who would be at that weight would probably be more active, eat differently to how I eat, and so on. So the idea is to adopt healthier habits and become more active. This is what James Clear in his book Atomic Habits refers to as a change in identity. So focus on who you want to become rather than the state you are in at that particular time or point in time. Now, this is important because if you want to become someone different to who you are now, maybe make an example that is relevant for relationships. Say, I want to become more intimate with my wife. If I want to become that person, then it is better to focus on the progression that I make in becoming that person rather than having a number attached to that and say, I'd want us to have sex 10 times a day, every day of the week. And the idea of identity change is very important, especially in our day and age, because we have a lot of people out there who are living borrowed identities, and that will be dealt with in a lot more detail in episode 11 when we talk about borrowed identities. But that is tip number 1, celebrate the wins. Tip number 2 is rethink your life goals. The problem with setting goals is not that they are not attainable. It is that we usually set goals based on where we are in life and what we know at that particular point in time. So I wanted to become a medical doctor at some point in my life because I saw a church mate of ours who appeared to be rich and had a seemingly wonderful family. So I correlated his lifestyle to his profession. It was a case of 1 plus 1 is 2. And I was wrong because I omitted in my thinking whether I'd be able to sustain all of these things while working in a profession as demanding as the medical field. No disrespect to you guys in the medical field, but it is very, very demanding. More demanding than I probably would have been able to sustain. And I also omitted the other inputs that went into becoming a medical doctor, like dealing with blood, which really makes me feel, oh. And Having regrets about going into the accounting field as I did instead of medicine would be unkind to the work that I've put in and the efforts that I've put into getting here. Another obvious fact is that medicine may have not been my thing, and I'm sure I wouldn't be where I am in terms of my life had I gone that route. And I'm also sure that some of us had aspirations that have evolved over time and based on the increase in our knowledge, have changed to fit what we now know or what we've now experienced. So letting go of some of the goals that you may have had based on the knowledge that you had 10 years ago is quite liberating, because if I'd still be having regrets about having not gone down the route of becoming a medical doctor at this point in my life, then that really disregards the fact that my life choice of going down the accounting route led me to reuniting with my wife, led me to meeting the friends that I now have, and some of the relationships that I built have come out of my pursuit of becoming a chartered accountant. So there's value in that, and there's value in the lessons that I've learned along the way. And it's very important to appreciate that and rethink where we want to be or who we want to be, rather than being fixated on what we wanted to be at the point we are at in our lives. The third tip is change your perspective. And this one is really continuing the narrative of regrets. Regrets are very short sighted, because I'm just thinking of a conversation that I had with my manager the other day, where he asked me whether I regret being in accounting. And I said to him, I don't, because my reason for not feeling any kind of regret for being in the accounting field, as opposed to, like I said earlier, medicine, is that the path that I've taken has led me to who I am right now. And all of that was shaped by the decisions that I made in the different situations that I went through, whether good or bad. And I also reunited with my wife in pursuit of becoming a chartered accountant, as I mentioned. So having regrets on any moment of my life would be injustice. It would be injustice because it would keep me from really seeing the valuable lessons and the valuable experiences that I've had in my path to where I am. Because what we often have regrets about is usually the mistakes that we've made in life, or the decisions that we consider to be mistakes in our lives. But regretting is like carrying the weight of yesterday when you have the weight of today to bear. And we did mention something similar to this in episode 9, where I had a conversation with Wafik talking about depression, where we said being depressed or being in a state of depression is like living multiple days in the space of one. And this is similar to how we go about life when we have regrets, because we fail to see the good that is before us, because we're so focused on the quote unquote bad that we've gone through in the past. So it's very important to change your perspective and see the lessons that came from the progression of the journey that you took to where you are, rather than regretting the decisions that you may have made in the past. Now, this leads me to tip number 4. Tip number 4 is forgive yourself. Some of the mistakes that we've made in the past have cost us a great deal. We've had relationships that are broken. We've let go of people who brought meaning and value in our lives. And sometimes we've hurt the people that we love and have caused irreparable damage in their lives as well as ours. And I rate that dwelling in the past is not really helpful for your future, because it usually leads to depression, and it is something that we really spoke about in episode 9 with Wafi. But bearing the weight of regret and the anxiety of an uncertain tomorrow can be crushing, and it can really stall your life in the moment. We often hear people say, live in the moment, appreciate the moment, savor the moment, or anything to that effect. So, forgiving ourselves is important because it enables us to appreciate what is before us, to appreciate the progress that we've made in our lives, um, leading to where we are. So, please forgive yourself. And the funny thing about forgiving yourself is that we often extend forgiveness to others and fail to do the same for ourselves. So it is very important to forgive yourself. We've got a lot of regrets, we've got a lot of mistakes that we've made in the past, and we really just chastise ourselves continually about those rather than uh, forgiving ourselves and moving on. Now, this isn't to mean that forgiving yourself is easy. Similar to how extending forgiveness to someone who has hurt you before is a challenge, it is also a challenge to extend forgiveness to yourself. And I think it is an acquired skill because it takes time to get to a point where you're like, what happened happened. I cannot go back and change it. But what I can do is change the way that I behave going forward. And that is, in effect, disallowing what has happened in the past from affecting how you act in the present going forward. So I think that is why forgiving yourself is very, very important. In any and all relationships, forgiving yourself for the things that you've done that you consider to be mistakes is very, very important. Now, we are heading on to tip number 5. And this one is, don't be a prisoner to your own plans. I think this one encapsulates my reason for recording this episode, or my reason for speaking about discontentment, because not being where you want to be is not very nice, but where you are is usually better than where you come from. And our mistake is usually being prisoners to what we've planned to do. Oh, I wanted to be married at age 25. And when age 25 comes around and I haven't necessarily achieved that, by the way, marriage is not an achievement, but I haven't necessarily gotten to that point of being married, then I start thinking that my whole life is a mess. Now, a wise person once said to me that your current life was once something you prayed for, so appreciate it. So, not being a prisoner to your own plans is very important because you could have been dead and buried for what it's worth. So, planning ahead is important, but don't let those plans suck the life out of you. Remember, you are the one who made them, and in the same breath, you are the one who can change them. Another thing is, we make plans similar to how I refer to how we make goals. We make plans on the basis of what we know. We make plans on the basis of the information that we have at the time. Now, talking about wanting to get married young, I wanted to get married young because I believe that it was important for me to get to that stage early and to start out building a life with my wife earlier on in life, have our children early so that we'd enjoy our 50s and 60s. In closing, I want to talk a little bit about the irony of calling this show Relationship Goals when I am advocating for a change in thinking and moving from a goal-oriented thinking to a system-oriented thinking. Your goal should be to become present in all relationships, to become intentional about building healthy relationships all around. And this is the point of this show. Not necessarily growing in one area of relationship, but growing intrapersonally or growing as a person, as an individual internally, and that then affecting how you operate in the relationships that you're in externally. And you'll find that this is a constant theme in this podcast. Becoming a better you will lead to you becoming better. in the relationships that you're in. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and thank you for tuning in. Thank you also for tuning into the previous episodes. As I said, I really, really appreciate your feedback and appreciate your support in listening to this podcast. I am Samgele Tabete, and this is Relationship Goals.